Right, so moving on to helping non-relatives. It was initially thought in the 1950s and before that individuals could perform a behaviour for the good of the group. So if you ever hear the phrase "for the good of the species" about why animals do stuff, they want to help their species not die out. An animal does this because it'll save the species from extinction. That should immediately raise alarm bells in your head, and this is something called naive group selectionism. Individuals never do something for the good of the species, because if you have, like this guy Wynne Edwards made the argument in the 60s that individuals would restrain their consumption of resources that are limited so that the species doesn't die out. And the problem with that is, a very nice idea, the problem with that is that a population full of restrained individuals would extremely quickly be invaded by a mutant, selfish individual that grabs more resources than it needed, than the others. This is summarised quite nicely in this lemming cartoon by Gary Larson, with your cheeky little lemming with a survival belt on. There is no way that populations of altruists that an individual would behave altruistically in order to promote the good of the group. It has to be an individual benefit. So with that in mind, how does altruism evolve among non-relatives? Well, firstly, we're going to resuscitate group selection as an idea. We'll talk about that in a sec. And secondly, there's this idea of you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. So individuals making deals with each other. We'll go through those in order, but we're going to start with modern group selection. So group selectionism as a whole, you'll read, there's a lot of shit flung at it in the literature for being naive. But you want to put that in a box. There's the thinking that I just described, individuals behaving for the good of the group, that is genuinely naive group selectionism. But in recent decades, this idea has been kind of rehabilitated, and a couple of experiments where the experimenter has kind of selected whole groups to survive and whole groups to die, has shown that, in fact, you can select at the level of the group. And the idea here is that cheaters may have an adverse effect upon the survival of the entire group. So if you take more resources than you need, that can affect whether the whole group survives. And so groups of cooperators might outcompete groups of cheaters, even if individually those cheaters might outcompete the cooperators. That sounds like naive group selectionism, but less so when you think about the different levels of selection. So this is now called multi-level selection, and it says that at each different level, consider this as long parallels between this and the major transitions in evolution that we met at the beginning of the lecture. Each group level, the selection at that level becomes a lot stronger when you have a lot of small groups with very little gene flow between them. And specifically, I should have written this on this slide, specifically the expected lifespan of the group needs to be similar or less than the expected lifespan of the individual. So the expected mortality rate of groups is similar to the expected mortality rate of individuals. So when you genuinely can have an effect on the whole group survival, that's when group selection, multi-level selection may kick in. But this has been proposed as an important alternative to, and possibly even a replacement for, kin selection in explaining altruism. But I want to hammer this point home. As yet, there is no convincing evidence for any trait which has been shaped by group selection in nature. We've got some lab experiments with very intriguing implications, but nothing as yet in nature. There's a few which claim to have shown it, and the first one which is unambiguously accepted will be a massive paper. But as yet, there's nothing really convincing for group selection in nature. CF, by contrast, there is absolutely shitloads of evidence for kin selection in nature. Models predict that you can only really get true group selection if there are no cheaters at all, i.e. you have genetic uniformity in the group, like clonal aphids, for example, or if there's somehow a suppression mechanism for cheaters, like there's a kind of a retaliatory kind of punishment mechanism for cheaters. It's really interesting to think how this might relate to us. We have to have legal systems in place to suppress cheaters. And there's an interesting argument that suggests that group selection may have played an important role in human evolution, which I'll leave you to go and research. But this Gardner and Grafen, oh damn, I didn't put the link up there. I'll make sure that link is active. Gardner and Grafen is a very interesting dissection of group selection as a concept. Finally, for the final bit of the lecture, I want to talk about reciprocity. Reciprocity is you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. And I'm going to talk about a human example, and the only reason I'm talking about this theoretical human example is because this is the way that we tend to frame this problem theoretically, generally. Like the first time this was articulated was using this example. It was illustrated by a game theory model called the prisoner's dilemma. Now, game theory is something stolen from economics. We're talking about deciding how best to behave in a given situation when other people are also deciding how best to behave. So if the best way to behave depends on what other people are choosing, then you have a different problem. You have a more complicated problem. And the game theory helps you decide what to do when other people are also deciding what to do. So the prisoner's dilemma is a particular game theory situation. You have two suspects for a crime, and they're kept in separate cells. They've both been arrested, and the police are interrogating them. And the police say, we've got enough evidence to charge you with a crime, but we're not quite sure if you did it or your accomplice did it, or if the other person did it. Do you want to rat out your partner? Do you want to rat out the other person? And if you say no, that's kind of the two of you cooperating against the police. But you can also rat out your partner, in which case we call it defecting against your partner. So if you both stay silent, if you both cooperate with each other, the idea is that you both get 2 years in jail. But if you rat out your partner, you can go free, but your partner gets 10 years. The thing is, though, that your partner is making the same decision. Your partner can choose to rat you out as well. And if you both defect, if you both choose to tell on each other, then you both get 5 years for being generally annoying. So, if we think about how best to behave in this circumstance, you can either cooperate or defect. You can betray your partner, or you can not betray your partner. And player B is also deciding what to do. So if you defect and your partner stays silent, you get nothing, and your partner gets 2 years in jail. If you both cooperate, you both get 2 years in jail. If you rat your partner out while they stay silent, you get nothing. If you stay silent while your partner rats you out, you get 10 years in jail. Whereas if you both decide to rat each other out, then you both get 5 years in jail. Now have a look at the payoffs involved here. Oops. Look at the payoffs to player A. In both cases, it doesn't matter, ignore which is the general maximum, regardless of what player A does, regardless of what player B does. in both cases, it's better for player A if player A defects rather than cooperates. So in both cases, the bottom row is bigger than the top row. And so that means A is better off defecting whatever B does. So we call this, in evolutionary terms, we call it an evolutionarily stable strategy to be defecting. And in fact, with only a single encounter, this is a very classic situation, and these terms have got generic names. We've got the reward for mutual cooperation. You've got the temptation to defect is always what you could have if you defect while the other person cooperates. You have a punishment for both defecting. If you both defect, you both get a kind of a punishment. And then if you cooperate while the other person defects, you get a sucker's payoff. In this kind of situation, you're always better defecting if there is a single encounter between you. And in fact, defect is also a stable strategy whenever you know exactly how many times you're going to be interacting. If you play that game multiple times, but you know that it's going to stop, then of course defection is going to be best on the last game, and that means that it's also going to be best on the next to last, and the next to last, and the next to last, all the way up to the first. So if you've got a finite number of encounters, you know that you're always better off telling on your partner. But then think about what happens if you have no idea how many encounters there'll be. There's an interesting Radiolab episode about this. I've linked it through. It's really not obvious what your best strategy is when you have no idea how many encounters you're going to have with a partner. And Axelrod and Hamilton, Robert Axelrod, staged a computer tournament where he invited people to bring algorithms that dealt with this. And he had hundreds and hundreds of algorithms competing against each other. And it turns out that the winner that got the best kind of evolutionary payoff over time, over hundreds, thousands, millions of encounters with a partner, was one which did a very, very simple, it was only 2 lines of code. Other people had these kind of great Bayesian algorithms that tried to predict what the partner would do in each case. But then the winner strategy was called tit for tat, which is do what the opponent did last time. And if you think about it, it very quickly, you know, if your opponent defected on the last game, you defect on this game. If your opponent cooperated last time, you cooperate this time. It retaliates against people that defect, but it forgives. It forgives very quickly if they learn to cooperate. So it can encourage cycles of repeated cooperation. And this is why I'm talking so extensively about it, because it's a way of encouraging cooperation. If you follow this tit-for-tat rule, cooperate if people have cooperated in the past, then you get these kind of virtuous circles of repeated cooperation. Of course, it can also lead to cycles of violence. Listen to the podcast episode, and you can explore a bit more of those dynamics. Evidence in nature for reciprocity comes, a lot of it comes from grooming. Primates will groom each other as a way of gaining favors later. You groom me now, I will groom you later. I can groom you now and you'll give me some kind of favor later in the future. There's an interesting set of papers. This Gomez et al. Talks about grooming for sex in primates, which is an interesting exchange. They talk about there being a marketplace in primate societies where individuals will groom in a kind of a payment for sex later on, which is very interesting. There's also, I'm running out of time, but I'm going to go into this. I'm just going to quickly mention this vampire bat example, where individuals are very unlikely to find, vampire bats going out at night are very unlikely to find a meal, and lots of them go hungry, but they will beg in other individuals in their roost. And those other individuals can choose whether or not to give up some of their blood altruistically And there's a reciprocity system going there where individuals that donated blood last time are more likely to receive blood from the bat they donated to the next time. And that Wilkinson reference talks all about that. I won't go into it in detail because there's not much time left. But it all depends on how long, how far away from starvation each individual bat is.